We're going to continue on with our conversations focusing on autonomy and defense tech and the defense sector more broadly. It is my absolute pleasure to continue the conversation from the earlier panel this morning with the co-founder and CEO of Aterian, Lorenz Meier, who lives on a plane, so he's come, I think, a long way to be here today. So Lorenz, thank you so much for being here. Let me welcome you to the stage.
Thank you.
So, in the spirit of not having long introductions, but getting right to the interesting conversation, first of all, I'm going to ask you about Aterian and what you guys are up to in Ukraine, because you have been at the cutting edge of deploying some of the new capabilities that are being used in theater on a daily basis now. But before we get there, I want to talk to you about Spiderweb, because the operation that Ukraine carried out just over the last weekend was not only innovative but sophisticated and used sort of the system of systems approach that General Petrescu talked about, combining traditional intelligence, new capabilities. Incredible operation that I think has been a complete game changer. You wrote about this very briefly, and I wanted to get you to talk about it because you said that the key takeaway from the operation is that the means employed are not just commercially available. Most of it is free on the internet, in fact. And as a result of this, we're entering a new era of warfare, where easily accessible technologies produce strategic outcomes. Those are your words, I think, on X. What did you mean by that?
I think what we've seen in Ukraine is initially innovation on the direct front line, right? Where on the brigade level, now suddenly you had a lower cost weapon to destroy tanks. Like the anti-tank guided missile got replaced by an FPV drone. Also increased the range, so it changed things a little bit. But what we're seeing now, like that was a tactical improvement that has been changing the battlefield entirely. Now we see a strategic change, because it's really hard to deter an adversary from shipping a handful of containers. That's like no intelligence agency in the world can credibly claim that they will find every single one of those. And that now means that this commercial technology suddenly is changing the, strategic game, and you have to rethink that. There are, of course, answers, and most NATO countries still have their hardened shelters. So there is always a defense to the offense, but I think we have to basically, this notion of that you have something that's thousands or tens of thousands of miles away from a front line and is safe there, that's gone. And it's gone at a ridiculously low price point. And I think what I also want to stress here, what has been employed in the attack is hobbyist gear. That's online, and I would say the intelligence part of the operation, and I have no particular insights there, but the intelligence part of the operation must have been really good and really clever and all that, and I'm not an expert on that. On the technology side, this was the most straightforward thing that any technologist could think of, and you could literally do that as a student project, because all the components are out there. So very sophisticated operation with incredibly accessible means, which means that any country in the world, and not just countries, also non-state actors, should be assumed to be capable of doing that. And I've actually been saying for the last decade or so, thank God that terrorists are dumb, because I was waiting for this moment. And so I think we have to also think about the fact that now, unfortunately, the world has been shown you can do this, you can get away with it, and it doesn't have to be just strategic tankers. So I do think we need to rethink air defense in a very profound way.
So we were on a panel in Washington as part of this big expo on AI right before I came here. and we had a conversation with somebody from the U.S. administration. We were talking about spiderweb, and this was on the record comments, and he said, we saw that, and I can tell you we can't do it, nor can we defend against it. But it sounds like what you're saying right now is, no, actually anybody can do it, but it's true that we can't really defend against it, right?
I can, yeah, certainly anybody can do it, yes. It's like, and if you look at a lot of cargo drone startups and university projects, it's the exact same thing. You connect a drone to the internet, you remotely control it. And I also want to point out, the effect of the attack was very impressive, but the video is actually giving away the whole UI, and you can clearly see those drones were flown manually. So somebody said, fly to this position on the wing, and then for those of us who have been to Ukraine, usually the trigger is like two metal wires that, if bent together, trigger the charge. So it's like the means employed are very, very straightforward, and are the exact same things that have been used. Millions of units of those have been used on the front line in Ukraine. What's different here is the sophisticated logistics to get some of these systems at the same time, thousands of miles across the country.
Yeah.
That is very sophisticated. I don't know how many people can do that, or organizations can do that. On the technology side, I can say we could do a hackathon over 48 hours with student teams, and out of 20 teams, we would get 12 of them to be able to carry out this attack one-to-one. We actually did prove that on a NATO hackathon a year ago in Krakow, where we gave student teams and also companies drones. We taught them how to write apps, and the first team had, after just 4 hours, AI-based terminal guidance targeting done, and it was approaching a Polish military vehicle. We were not allowed to fly into them. It would have been more spectacular, but it worked. And so 4 hours. 4 hours. Wow. And so I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the technological barrier is so incredibly low. At the same time, we're now also, and I think drones start to be a little bit like cyber. There's offensive and defensive. We as a company start to be working heavily on air defense. And it's the exact same drones that are being used for ground-to-ground. And Rheinmetall has just come out with a press release showing the effectors that are powered by Auterion OS taking out drones. So there's a cure to this. If you have a container with your own drones on base, and a not so expensive, relatively straightforward radar, you can take this out. It's just that we've now seen a technological, I wouldn't even seen a technological leap, an operational brilliance leap that actually was obvious for any technologist. And yes, it will change how air defense works, and maybe those good old NATO shelters will all be crowded again soon.
Well, before we get to that dystopian vision, Auterion actually came up in the previous panel, so your reputation precedes you. We were talking about the lessons learned from the battlefield in Ukraine, and I mentioned that you have been deploying in Ukraine at increasing rates over the course of the full-scale invasion. What have you been up to, and what have you learned?
So some of these operations are classified. Some are more visible. I would say that a few of the things we've done are on Twitter, but we prefer to not make that connection. But if you look at some videos closely, not spiderweb, but if you look at other videos closely, you can basically see that UI looks familiar. We've scaled from initially special operations in the hundreds to tens of thousands this year. So we're in good distribution there. And then I think one thing that I actually want to pioneer a little bit, and it sounds so basic, is to bring Ukrainian learnings into Western militaries, and to bring that in with the humility that the world-leading technology on drones is right now in Ukraine. There's unfortunately also pretty good technology on the Russian side, which we should not ignore, but that doesn't matter to us. And what I'm finding, so this is maybe a perfect segue, what I'm finding, we're quite unique. I don't know if there's any other company like us, because we build software and guidance computers, and we work with Ukrainian manufacturers. We also work with American and Dutch and German manufacturers, but in Ukraine, the large number of units is powered by Ukrainian companies. So we're not trying to cook up a new solution in Munich or Silicon Valley and try to ship it there. We're truly partnering. And we're also doing the reverse. So we brought a Ukrainian company that builds a long-range drone with 1,000 miles range, 1,500 kilometers, into a DoD program. And there are others that do that too, but I think that was the first time. And what I would love to see in Europe and in the US, where we're based, are two things. A little bit more humility towards the Ukrainian players, because they're not cobbling just stuff together. It's actually really sophisticated. And they're very humble about it, and they're willing to share. Almost every company tells you exactly what the secret insight is that makes this stuff work. It's an innovation ecosystem. And to take them seriously and to build partnerships how they can access the Western market, because that will give us all better technology at the mass scale price points that we need. For comparison, an Anduril loitering munition is $500,000. The Ukrainian equivalent is maybe $20,000 and more battle tested. And we need affordable mass. Like, the way to counter Russian and Chinese mass is with affordable autonomous mass. And these Ukrainian partners can do that. That's one important learning. The other important learning is I run right now a lot into the conversation around we need to do requirements engineering and testing, and we need to do some early RDT&E in our militaries, because that's the usual cycle. And that is interesting because we have TRL-9, so combat-proven systems in Ukraine that we could readily adopt, but right now what I see a lot in government programs is, we'll do some innovation stuff first, and then in 5 years we have a system. And that's actually, in a way, locking out Ukrainian companies, because it makes the fact that they have a finished product, it devalues it, because the system says, I don't want to buy a finished product. I don't want to buy 10,000 units. I want to buy 2, and preferably from our national industry. So I would encourage the West, in order to stay competitive with Russia and to get ready for China, because we don't have 5 to 7 years for China, to try to say okay, we want to do some RDT&E, but we also want some scale partnerships with Ukrainian technology, maybe European or American prime. There's industrial policy that is valid. There's supply chain concerns that are valid. A lot of these Ukrainian companies are, from their setup, from their financial setup, complex. So they're all reasons. But you can adopt technology today, and you should bring that into your forces, and you should use it as a forcing function to change your force design.
Exactly.
So I think those things, we need a lot more of that, because we don't have time. And one of the largest defense prime in Taiwan just released a video this week showing our terminal guidance solution on a Taiwanese drone with all the learnings out of Ukraine, with a real warhead striking targets. We are in Taiwan today. We're not doing research. We're doing tech transfer out of Ukraine right away. And for some of these near peer adversaries, we are potentially on a 2-year clock. So we don't have that 5-year cycle.
So I think you brought up something really important, a lot of important issues that if we had 2 hours we could get into. But I think one is the tech export from Ukraine directly to Taiwan. I mean, this is a completely new vector, but more and more this will have to be the kind of cycle that we will have to all kind of get with to understand what are the consequences, the lessons, but also the real-time applications that can be applied now, not a year from now or 2 years from now, into potential battle scenarios of the future, right? And, I was struck by a conversation that you and I had, I think at the last NATO Summit in Washington, where we talked about the adaptation cycle, right? And how rapidly it's happening and that we don't have a lot of time. And I remember what you said then, which was that in Ukraine, the adaptation cycle, meaning how fast the Russians are able to adapt to the changes Ukrainians are making in the autonomous capability space writ large, is 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, you're going to have to update and update and update, and then they're catching up and catching up. Is that still the case today from your experience?
Yeah.
And if so, who do you think has the competitive advantage right now?
I think it's pretty much a cat and mouse game that is really, really close. And and the tactics, by the way, are evolving. We're seeing now, if you go on Twitter, you see Russian videos reposted from Telegram shooting down Ukrainian ISR drones, with interceptors. You see the same from Ukrainian drones. You now see a lot of Russian drones that fly evasive maneuvers when they detect an interceptor. No NATO kit is currently capable of doing that. And that would mean that even if we now adopt ISR drones on the brigade level, if we face a near-peer adversary like Russia or China, those ISR drones would be gone within the first 10 minutes. Not with expensive air defense missiles, but with some FPVs they're launching and queuing with a cheap ground-based radar they have. So I think we have to get on that cycle. And to be on that cycle, you have to be regularly in Ukraine and you have to be working with the companies there and not just testing your stuff. Because I've seen almost every Western defense startup claiming they've tested their stuff. And then when I'm in Kiev, I'm asking, okay, have you heard anything? Is anybody using this? And the answer is no. And you can even see that from the announcements of those companies themselves, because if they were selling at scale into Ukraine, they would be talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars they're making. And if they're not talking about it, they're probably not selling at scale.
Yeah. So Europe is supposedly spending on defense now. I say supposedly because there's a process, and when the money will actually get into the pockets of companies and go into development, all of that is still a question mark. But certainly, defense and security is back on the agenda in a big way. There are serious steps that are being taken by the EU, by individual nation states, also by NATO. Obviously, the big conversation is how will Europe fill the gap of a U.S., maybe not withdrawal, but definitely drawdown. That is happening. But it's going to take a long time for Europe to build an actual army. There is no European army, there is no NATO army, right? You're not going to build a defense industrial base overnight. But you can build a lot of drones very, very quickly. So with the conversation earlier was really focused on how do national armies also integrate autonomous capabilities into their force structure and force posture. But I think there's a bigger vision there that maybe we all need to think about, and I've heard you talk about before. What do you think the future force is actually going to look like, given the kind of innovation that's taking place today?
So I think I think the German's Zeitenwende is the perfect example of the right vision and then a different execution. Now I have more hope since that has been re-energized now, but this happens a lot. And for example, from a force design perspective, the chief of the British Army has said a few things that are, I think, bang on. 50% of procurement should go into new autonomous systems. So not like 90%, 50%, which is a big change. And quite frankly, I only believe you can realistically do that if you almost double your defense budget, because otherwise you have all these turf fights that will take years to resolve. And he also expects that in the future, 80% of kinetic effects on the target will be delivered by autonomous systems. Not 100%. I don't think that tanks, artillery, or fighter jets will go away because they project the mass force, the mass kinetic effects on the battlefield. They effectively hold lines. But beyond their range, you have now autonomous systems that, and I'm totally expecting drone against drone combat as sort of the first phase of any future conflict. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, I think honestly, it means really two things. Number one, you need to increase your defense spending if you realistically want to adopt quickly, because otherwise the turf fights on maintaining your existing tanks will consume everything. So I think a few countries, Poland, Germany, others, are on a good track. I think there's some interesting development in the Nordics. The Brits have the right vision, but I haven't seen the budget move accordingly. So it's going to be hard because they would need to make really hard decisions. And after just announcing 16 new submarines, that if you had announced 15, you could actually buy a lot of autonomous systems. So I think that's the one thing. And then again, the other thing is, do not go into the RDT&E and whatever cycle, because basically what that means, the first thing you'll do is you slow everything down, you distribute the money across Europe, and you're not accelerating the companies that have proven on the battlefield that they actually create value. So I think what Europe should do is buy tens of thousands of drones right now. And what I often see when I talk to procurement or military is they're saying, oh, but in 2 years they're old, and how can we make sure that we don't spend money right now, but you build as industry the perfect technology, and you scale your company, and you can make millions of things, but we don't want to buy. We like to say in the defense industry, spending money is very different than making money. And so I think what would be really important, and if you all can carry that forward into the organizations you're working with, is buy drones. And if you're worried that they get outdated, send them to Ukraine and Taiwan. They will be put to good use, because that's way better spent money than forking out research grants and slowing everything down. If you want an industry, you need to buy from an industry. If you put out R&D grants, what will happen is that you create a whole researchy environment with no accountability for performance.
Because de facto, the research is being done on the battlefield in Ukraine, being tested, researched all at the same time. So Lorenz, I appreciate your comments and your vision for the future. I think often we have these conversations, I'm struck with how much opportunity there is for NATO and Europe to really, I think, jumpstart their capabilities and build a future force, not the force necessarily even for today, but the force for a year from now, 2 years from now. But you have to take risk, I think, is the point you're making. And that's a very different cultural notion or perspective here in Europe than is in the United States or in the private sector, right? Where risk aversion seems to still dominate. So my last, just very, very, very brief, because I know we're out of time. Do you see that changing? Do you see Europe becoming less risk averse?
I mean, certainly the case. But still, these R&D, this R&D view is not exactly that. Like the Dutch, for example, they're just buying drones. The Danish are just buying drones. That's taking risk. Yeah, they might not work, they might be outdated, but they have moved things forward. One thing I also want to stress, which is not in line of your question, but it is super important. Drones are not aircraft. They are munitions. And if NATO should learn anything from the 155 millimeter debacle, you have to drive interoperability on drones. If you field a NATO force of drones of German and Portuguese and British that are not on the same language and cannot run the same software, you will have the equivalent of a NATO without English. And when you make contact with the enemy who speaks consistently Russian or consistently Chinese, you will completely lose against the drone swarms. And so I cannot stress enough that right now all the European nations are trying to create their national champion. So it's again the 155 motion. And I think what has to happen, and yes, this is also self-serving because we've seen that problem, we're trying to solve it, you have to separate software and hardware. You have to buy those separately. If you buy software and hardware separately, you can drive standardization. But if you're buying vertically integrated monolithic systems, the vendors will always find a way to lock you in. And the problem of that is that you will not have those swarms. I'm looking at the commander of the European forces. Like, you wouldn't be able to employ your whole forces. You would have like these different things. So this is maybe the most important thing that nobody's thinking about.
Sounds like you're saying open source.
Well, not necessarily open source. We don't want the Russians to have all the latest kit.
Secure, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Open standards.
Open standards.
And the same software.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Lorenz, I think you also just gave me a quick opportunity to plug a SEPA paper that is, I think, out there on the tables that looks at interoperability in the digital domain across NATO lines, so how we can avoid exactly what you're talking about right now with this move towards sovereignty, which we all understand, but that sovereignty shouldn't come at the cost of a lack of interoperability in the military space.
And the trick there is sovereignty means you have your own supply chains, you have your own factories, you have a copy of the software. The good thing about software is it can be copied, right? It can be shared. A factory is hard to share. It's either here or it's there. But software can be in both places. And so that's an opportunity to have both sovereignty on a national level, but interoperability on a Western alliance level.
So, Lorenz, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your insights. Let's all join me in thanking Lorenz Meier, the CEO of Aterion. Thank you.
Thank you.